story of Robinson Crusoe. A sailing ship was on its way from England to the Spice Islands when it ran into a great storm. For 3 days and 3 nights the storm raged. The sailors did their best to keep the ship afloat, but in the end all their valiant efforts were in vain, and the ship sank. There was only one lifeboat, into which climbed the captain and many of the crew, but soon afterwards a great wave engulfed the boat, and it was never seen again. Only one man survived. He was lucky enough to see a great chunk of the wooden mast in the sea, and he clung to it until the storm had passed. His name was Robinson Crusoe. Clinging to that wooden spar for more days than he could remember, he saw one day an island in the distance. The sea was carrying him towards the island. Robinson Crusoe gathered his strength and climbed up to stand on the wooden spar. He could see that the island was quite small. There were trees on it, and presently he saw a flock of birds flying above the trees. In a few hours he felt a bump when the wooden spar touched the beach. There was sand and rocks, and Robinson Crusoe was able to crawl up the beach away from the sea that had almost killed him to the safety of dry land near the trees. Then he slept. He did not wake up until the next day. The first thing he did was to explore about him. He was lucky enough to find one box that had been on the sailing ship. Inside it he found some tools, an axe, a saw, some knives, boxes of nails, and some ropes. It was little enough, but he was grateful. He fell to his knees and thanked God for his deliverance. Having decided to climb the mountain in the center of the island, Robinson Crusoe set out the next day. He had not eaten for days and was very weak, but worst of all was his raging thirst. He had found coconuts with milk inside, but although the taste was good, he found the milk did not quench his thirst. Then he found a small stream. It was running from the mountain into the sea. He tasted the water. It was pure and cold. Now his hopes began to rise. He had found fresh water and nuts, and perhaps now he could find more food. It took him all day to climb up the mountain, but once there, he could see all around the island, and blue sea stretching away to the far horizon. He felt he was alone in the world. From where he was, he saw only the sea. The island, he was almost very small, and he could see no other. As the sun began to go down, he saw the most beautiful skies he had ever seen in his life. It was too late to climb down the mountain, so he made a rough shelter for himself and settled down to sleep. The next day, Robinson Crusoe made his way back to his own camp, which he had made near the beach where he had first landed. He spent a few days making a hut out of branches from the trees, and when it was completed, he was very pleased with it. Using coconut shells to carry and store water, he knew he was safe from thirst. Also, he had seen many fish in the shallows, and he found a way to catch them. In the old box containing the tools, he had found a tinder box. Useless when he first found it, but now, dry again, he was able to make a fire. That evening he had one of the best meals of his life, and he thanked God for it. It was on the morning of the next day that he saw the footprint in the sand. They'd been made by human feet. Of that he was certain. And whoever had made them had been observing Robinson Crusoe in his rough camp. He was a little afraid, for he had thought himself alone on the island, but now he wondered if there were savages to contend with. He had no weapons to defend himself should an enemy appear. One of the first things Robinson Crusoe had done after finding himself alone on the island was to keep a diary. He had found a supply of ink in some wreckage on the beach, so with that and quill feathers for pens, he recorded the events in his life on the island. It was on a Friday, soon after the shipwreck, that he discovered the person who had made the footprints in the sand. It was a man who wore only a straw skirt. He was not at all savage. In fact, he was more scared of Robinson Crusoe than Robinson was of him. He had no language, and only the simplest means of surviving on the island. His home was no more than a hole in the ground covered by leaves of the palm tree, nor had he ever seen a fire, for when he saw Robinson Crusoe's fire he was terribly afraid of it. But he knew how to catch fish, which he ate raw, and he knew where certain birds laid a plentiful supply of eggs, which were very tasty. The two men became close friends. Robinson called the other man Friday, and he began to teach him how to speak. Man Friday learned very quickly. In return, he showed Robinson Crusoe where to find eggs and certain fruits and nuts, which all helped to keep them both healthy. Most of their days were spent hunting for food or in improving their shelter. There'd been no sign of a boat in the sea ever since the wreck, and so Robinson Crusoe almost began to believe he would never be rescued. But one day, when he and Man Friday were collecting eggs from up the mountain, he saw the white sails of a ship heading towards the island. In great excitement, the two men quickly lit a large signal fire, covering the flames with lots of greenery to create as much smoke as possible. By the time they had reached the beach and their shelter, they could see the ensign on the stern of the approaching boat. The ship was an English merchantman. Long before the sun went down on that memorable day for Robinson Crusoe and his man Friday, he had shaken the hand of the captain and stepped aboard the ship that was to take him to England. Man Friday went to England with his beloved master. He had learned to speak English, and he wore the clothes of an Englishman, but he never changed his name, and Man Friday lived in London with Robinson Crusoe until the end of his days. They both became famous throughout the world. The story of the third voyage of Sinbad. After a very short time, I became bored with the pleasant, easy life I led in Baghdad, and so once more I set sail with other merchants for distant lands. One day, while out at sea, we were caught by a terrible wind which blew us completely off course, and, lasting several days, finally drove us into harbour on a strange island. "Oh, I'd rather have come to anchor anywhere else but here," the captain said. "This island is inhabited by hairy savages who will certainly attack us. Whatever these dwarfs may do, we dare not resist, for if one of them's killed, the rest will fall upon us and speedily make an end of us." Only too soon we were to find out that the captain spoke truly. A vast number of hideous savages appeared, not more than 2 feet tall and covered with reddish fur. Throwing themselves into the waves, they surrounded our vessel. Clutching at ropes and gangways, they swarmed up the ship's side with such speed that they almost seemed to fly. Hoisting the sails and cutting the cable of the anchor, they steered us to an island where they drove us ashore. Then, taking possession of the ship, they made off to the place from which they'd come, leaving us helpless on the shore. Turning away from the sea, we wandered miserably inland, and presently saw in the far distance what seemed to be a splendid palace. When we reached it, we saw that it was a castle, lofty and strongly built. Pushing back the heavy ebony doors, we entered the courtyard, but at the threshold of the great hall beyond, we paused with horror at the sight that greeted us. On one side lay a huge pile of bones, human bones, and on the other a number of spits for roasting. Overcome with despair, we sank to the ground. The sun was setting when a loud noise aroused us. The door of the hall burst open, and a horrible giant entered. He was as tall as a palm tree, all black, and had only one eye, which flamed like burning coal in the middle of his forehead. His teeth were long and sharp, and he grinned horribly, while his lower lip hung down upon his chest, and he had ears as large as an elephant's, which covered his shoulders, and nails like the claws of some fierce bird. At this terrible sight, our senses left us, and we lay like dead men. When at last we came to, the giant sat examining us attentively with his fearful eye. Presently he stretched out his hand, took me by the back of the neck, and turned me this way and that. But feeling that I was mere skin and bone, He set me down again and went on to the next man. At last he came to the captain, and finding him the fattest of all, he stuck him on a spit and lit a huge fire at which he presently roasted him. After he'd eaten the captain, he lay down to sleep, snoring like the loudest thunder, while we lay shivering with horror the whole night through. When day broke, the giant got up and left the castle. When we believed him to be really gone, we rose and started bemoaning our horrible fate. Our despairing cries echoed down the hall. Though we were many and our enemy was alone, it did not occur to us to kill him. It would have been a hard task by any means, so, submitting to our sad fate, we spent the day wandering up and down the island, eating such fruit as we could find, and when night came we returned to the castle, having found no other place of shelter. At sunset the giant returned, ate one of our men, and slept and snored till dawn, when he left us again. Our condition was so bad that some of my companions thought it better to leap from the cliffs and perish in the sea, but I had a plan of escape which I told them, and to which they at once agreed. "Listen, my brothers," I said. "You know that plenty of driftwood lies along the shore. Let us make several rafts and carry them to a suitable place. Then we can wait for the chance of some passing ship which would rescue us from this fatal island." We spent the day building the rafts, and at nightfall we returned to the castle. Very soon the giant came, and another of our men was sacrificed. But the time of our revenge was at hand. When he'd finished, he lay down to sleep, and when we heard him snore, I and several of the bravest of my comrades quietly got up and each took a spit, which we heated in the fire, and then plunged it into the giant's eye, completely blinding him. With a terrible cry, he sprang to his feet, clutching in all directions to try and seize one of us, but we all fled into different ways and threw ourselves flat into corners where he was not likely to touch us with his feet. He fled out of the door, howling frightfully. As soon as he was gone, we hastened to leave the castle and waited beside our rafts to see what would happen next. If by sunrise we saw nothing of the giant and no longer heard his howls, which still came faintly through the darkness, we would conclude that he was dead, and it would be safe for us to remain on the island and not risk our lives on the frail rafts. But, alas, in the morning our enemy approached, supported by 2 other giants as large and fearful as himself, and a crowd of others following close upon their heels. Hesitating no longer, we clambered on our rafts and rowed with all our might out to sea. The giants, seeing our escape, grabbed huge pieces of rock and, wading into the water, hurled them after us, so that all the rafts except mine were crushed and their crew drowned. I and my 2 companions fought hard to keep our own raft beyond the reach of the giants, and with persistent rowing we at last came upon the open sea. Here we were at the mercy of the winds and waves, which tossed us to and fro all day and night, but the next morning we found ourselves near an island and landed there. There we discovered delicious fruits, and having satisfied our hunger, we lay down to rest on the shore. Suddenly we were startled by a loud rustling noise, and saw that a huge snake was gliding towards us over the sand. Swiftly it seized one of my comrades before he had time to run, and crushed him in its mighty coils and swallowed him up. My other companion and I fled for our lives, and seeing a tall tree, we climbed it. When night came, I fell asleep, only to be woken up once more by this terrible snake, which, after hissing around the tree, at last reared itself up against it, and finding my comrade, who was perched just below me, swallowed him up also. When the sun rose, I crept down from the tree, determined to do all I could to save myself. All day long I collected quantities of dry brushwood, reeds, and thorns, which I bound with faggots, and making a circle with them under my tree, I piled them up until I had a kind of tent into which I crouched. That same night the snake returned, eager to devour me, and glided round and round my frail shelter, seeking an entrance. Every moment I feared it might succeed in pushing aside some of the faggots, but luckily they held together, and when it grew light, my enemy retired to his den. As for me, I was more dead than alive. Shaking with fright and half suffocated by the poisonous breath of the monster, I came out of my tent and crawled down to the sea. To my joy and relief, I saw a ship sailing by, and shouting wildly and waving my turban, I managed to attract the attention of the crew. A boat was sent to rescue me, and very soon I found myself surrounded by a crowd of wondering sailors who were eager to know how I had come to be on that desolate island. I told them my story, and they generously gave me food and a coat to wear. We sailed to the island of Salahat, and as I stood watching the merchants disembarking their goods and preparing to sell and exchange them, the captain came up to me and said, "I've here some merchandise belonging to a passenger of mine who's dead. Will you do me the favour to trade with it, and when I meet with his next of kin I shall be able to give them the money, though you will receive a fair portion for your trouble." I agreed, and he pointed the bales out to me and sent for the man whose duty it was to keep a list of the goods that were on the ship. When this man came, he asked in what name the merchandise was to be registered. "In the name of Sinbad the sailor," the captain replied. At this I was greatly surprised, but looking at him carefully, I recognized him to be the captain of the ship of my previous voyage, where I had also been stranded on an island and thought to have lost all my goods. "Captain," I asked, "the merchant who owned those bales was called Sinbad?" "Yes," he replied, "he came from Baghdad and joined my ship, but by misfortune he was left behind on a desert island where we'd landed to fill up our water casks. It was not until 4 hours later that he was missed, but by that time we were too far out at sea to turn back." "And do you suppose him to have died?" I asked. "Alas, yes," he replied. "Why, Captain," I exclaimed, "look at me. I am that Sinbad who found himself abandoned on that island." The captain stared at me in amazement, but was presently convinced that I was speaking the truth and rejoiced greatly at my escape. With gratitude I took my goods, and as we went from island to island I sold and exchanged them for many wonderful things. I returned to Baghdad with so much money that I could not myself count it. I gave generously to the poor and bought some land to add what I already possessed, and thus ended my 3rd voyage. The story of the 4th voyage of Sinbad. As rich and happy as I was after my last voyage, I could not make up my mind to stay at home altogether, and so I took sail to a distant seaport. For some time all went well, but then we were caught in a violent hurricane, and our vessel became a total wreck, despite the efforts our captain took to save her, and many of our company perished in the waves. I, with a few others, had the good fortune to be washed ashore, clinging to pieces of the wreck, for the storm had driven us near an island. We threw ourselves down quite exhausted and waited till morning. At daybreak we wandered inland and saw some huts. As we drew near, their inhabitants swarmed out in great numbers and surrounded us. We were led to their houses and divided among our captors. I, with 5 others, were taken into a hut, where we were made to sit on the ground, and certain herbs were given us to eat. Observing that our captors did not touch them, I only pretended to taste my portion. But my companions, being very hungry, ate all that was set before them, and very soon I realized they were becoming mad. Though they chattered continually, I could not understand a word they were saying, nor did they pay any attention when I spoke to them. The savages now produced large bowls full of rice, prepared with coconut oil. Again my comrades ate eagerly, but I only tasted a few grains, understanding clearly that our captors wanted to fatten us as quickly as possible for their own eating, and this is precisely what happened. My unlucky companions, having lost all their reason, felt neither anxiety nor fear, and ate greedily all that was offered them. Soon they were fat, and that was the end of them. But I grew leaner day by day, since I ate so little. And since I didn't provide a very tempting feast for my captors, I was allowed to wander about freely. And one day, when all the savages had gone off on some expedition, leaving only an old man to guard me, I managed to escape from him and plunged into the forest, running as fast as my feet would carry me. For 7 days I ran, resting only when the darkness stopped me. On the 8th day I reached the seashore and saw a party of men gathering pepper, which grew in abundance all around. I approached them, and they greeted me in Arabic, asking who I was and where I came from. I was so delighted at hearing this familiar speech, and readily told them how I had been shipwrecked and captured. I stayed with them until they'd collected as much pepper as they needed, and then they took me back to their own country and presented me to their king. He received me with great hospitality and provided me with food and new clothes. The island was full of people, and a great deal of traffic went on in the capital, so that I soon began to feel at home and contented. The king treated me with special favor, and everyone at court and in town made life pleasant for me. One thing I found very strange. Everyone rode their horses without bridle or stirrups. So one day I asked His Majesty why he did not use them, to which he replied, "You speak to me of things of which I'd never heard before." This gave me an idea. I found a clever workman and made him cut out, under my direction, the foundation of a saddle, which I wadded and covered with the best leather and adorned with a rich gold embroidery. I then instructed a locksmith to make me a pair of spurs, and when all these things were completed, I presented them to the king and showed him how to use them. When I'd saddled one of his horses, he mounted it and rode about, quite delighted with the novelty. To show his gratitude, he rewarded me with large gifts. After this, I had to make saddles for all the principal officers of the king's household, and as they all gave me rich presents, I soon became very wealthy and quite an important person in the city. One day the king sent for me and said, "Sinbad, I'm going to ask a favor of you. Both I and my people respect you and wish you to end your days among us. Therefore I desire you to marry a rich and beautiful lady whom I will find for you, and think no more of your own country." As the king's will was law, I accepted the charming bride he presented to me and lived happily with her. Nevertheless, I had every intention of escaping at the first opportunity and going back to Baghdad. Things were going well for me when it happened that the wife of one of my neighbors, with whom I had struck up a friendship, fell ill and presently died. I went to his house to offer my consolations and found him in the depths of despair. "Heaven preserve you," I said, "and send you a long life." "Alas," he repeated, "what is the good of saying that when I have but an hour to live?" Come, I said. "Surely it's not so bad as all that. I trust that you will enjoy many more years." "No," he said. "All is finished for me. I have set my house in order, and today I shall be buried with my wife. This has been the law on our island from the earliest ages. The living husband goes to the grave with his dead wife, and likewise the living wife with her dead husband. So did our fathers, and so must we do. The law does not change, and we must all submit to it." As he spoke, his friends and relations began to assemble. The body, covered in rich robes and sparkling jewels, was laid on an open frame, and the procession took its way to a high mountain at some distance from the city. The sad husband, dressed in a black cloak, followed. At the graveside the corpse was lowered. Then the husband, saying farewell to all his friends, stretched himself onto the frame. He was given 7 loaves of bread and a pitcher of water, and then he was let down into the horrible depths of the cavern. A stone was laid on the opening, and mournfully the people made their way back into the city. Although the others were accustomed to these proceedings since their youth, I was so horrified that I could not help telling the king how it struck me. "Sir," I said, "I'm so astonished at the strange custom that exists in your country of burying the living with the dead. In all my travels I've never before met with so cruel and horrible a law." "It is the law for everyone," the king replied.
I myself shall be buried with the Queen if she were to die first.
But, Your Majesty, I said, may I ask if this law applies to foreigners also?
Why, yes, the king replied smilingly. They are no exception to the rule if they have married in this country. When I heard this, I went home with a heavy mind and heart. When my wife's little finger ached, I imagined she was going to die, and sure enough, before very long, she fell in and died within a few days.
My despair was great, for to be buried alive seemed to me a worse fate than to be eaten by cannibals. But there was no escape. The body of my wife, dressed in her richest robes and decked with jewels, was laid upon the frame. I followed it, and behind me came a great procession, headed by the king and all his nobles. And so we reached the fatal mountain. Here I made one last effort to arouse the pity of the king, but it was in vain. No one spoke to us. I speedily found myself lowered into the gloomy pit with 7 loaves of bread and a pitcher of water beside me. Even before I'd reached the bottom, the stone was rolled into its place above my head, and I was left to my fate. A thin ray of light shone into the cavern through some chink, and when I had the courage to look about me, I saw that I was in a huge vault with bones of the dead on the ground. I even thought I heard the final sounds of those who, like myself, had come into this place alive. I shrieked with rage and despair, cursing my fate, but at length, growing calmer, took the bread and water and groped towards the end of the cavern where the air was fresher. Here I lived in darkness and misery until my provisions were exhausted, but just as I was nearing death from starvation, the rock was rolled away overhead, and I saw that another frame was being lowered into the cavern, and that the corpse upon it was a man. In a moment my mind was made up. The woman who followed could only expect a lingering death. I should be doing her a service if I shortened her misery, so when she descended, already paralyzed with terror, I struck her dead with a huge bone and secured her provisions of bread and water, which gave me a hope for life. I was forced to repeat this action several times, and do not know how long I had been a prisoner when one day I heard something near me that breathed very loudly. I saw a shadowy form that squeezed itself into a cranny in the wall. I pursued it as fast as I could and found myself in a narrow crack among the rocks. I was just able to force my way through and followed it for many miles. At last I saw a glimmer of light which grew clearer every moment until I emerged upon the seashore with such a joy that I cannot describe. When I was sure that I was not dreaming, I realized that it was some little animal which had found its way into the cavern from the sea, and when disturbed by me had fled, showing me a means of escape which I could never have discovered for myself. I then returned to the cavern and amassed a rich treasure of diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and jewels of all kinds which were strewn on the ground. These I bundled together and stored them in a safe place on the beach, and then waited hopefully for the passing of a ship. But I had to wait 2 days before a vessel appeared. Waving my arms and crying out loud, I succeeded in attracting the attention of the crew. A boat was sent to me, and in answer to the questions of the sailors as to how I came to be in such a plight, I said that I had been shipwrecked, but had managed to scramble ashore with the bundles that I kept on the beach. Luckily, they believed my story, and without even looking at the place where they found me, took my bundles and rowed me back to the ship. Once on board, I saw that the captain was too much preoccupied with the difficulties of navigation to pay me much heed, though he made me welcome and would not accept any of the jewels which I offered to pay my passage with. And so, after visiting many lands, I found myself at last in Baghdad once more, with riches of every description. Again, I gave large sums of money to the poor and enriched all the mosques in the city. Then I devoted myself to my friends and relations, passing my time in pleasure and enjoyment.
story of Ahmed and the Sultan's daughter. Once upon a time, in a faraway country where it was always sunny and warm, there lived a poor man who made pots for a living. He had to work very hard from early in the day until late every night. First, he had to get his clay ready. Then he shaped his pots, and finally he baked them in the oven he'd made. With the pots, he made enough money for his wife and 6 children to live on. The potter was a very strong man. He could crack a hard nut between his fingers. Many people would not believe that he could until they saw it with their own eyes. In the village where the potter lived with his family, he was known to be a fearless man, as well as a strong one. On 2 occasions he'd fought with a bear that had wandered in from the forest, and made the bear run away. The potter had shown no fear, and in the end it was the bear that ran away because he was afraid. The youngest of the potter's children was called Achmed. He was not particularly strong, or brave, or clever, nor was he weak, or a coward, or stupid. Ahmed was simply a normal, average little boy, with a sunny smile that made everybody like him. He often wished that he saw his father a lot more than he did, but his father was always at work, or he came home late at night when Ahmed was asleep. Ahmed liked to wander off on his own through the village and into the woods. On the other side of the woods was a mountain. Ahmed always took with him his own little dog, which he called Cuddles. They were out together one fine day when the sun was very bright, making Ahmed very happy. He had a tiny flute, and he played it as they went along. Cuddles liked to hear music. He seemed to be dancing to the tune. When they arrived at the pond in the woods, Ahmed sat down to eat his sandwiches. Suddenly, he heard a cry. At first he didn't know what it was, but then he listened more carefully. It was someone calling for help. Ahmed realized it was the voice of a girl. "Help! Help me!" she was crying. Together with Cuddles, Ahmed ran to the water, and there he saw a little girl had fallen in. At first Ahmed was afraid to go in the water, for he'd not long learned how to swim. Then he saw that Cuddles had jumped in the pond and was swimming to the drowning girl. Ahmed had never seen Cuddles swim before, but he seemed to know how. But when Cuddles reached the little girl, he could do no more than swim round and round her, barking. The next minute Ahmed forgot all his fears and jumped in the water. He was wearing all his clothes, so it was hard to swim, but he reached the girl and held her arm. Then he even surprised himself, for he was able to pull the girl along as he swam to the bank. For a while she was too tired to speak. They all lay down on the grass, getting back their breath. Then, at last, the girl spoke to them. "I am the daughter of the Sultan who rules this land. My father will want to thank you. Please come with me to the palace." But Ahmed was too humble. "I'm only the son of a poor potter. I cannot go to the palace of the Sultan." Then he saw Cuddles was licking the little girl's face. She put her arms around the dog and hugged him. "Perhaps your dog has more courage than you, for I am sure he will come with me to the palace." And with that she stood up and walked away, followed by Cuddles barking happily. Ahmed had to follow. At the great palace, Ahmed met the mighty Sultan, who wore a golden crown. When he held out his hand to Ahmed, he saw that the Sultan had a jeweled ring on every one of his fingers. The Sultan thanked Ahmed for his bravery. "But sire," said Ahmed, "the bravest of us is my dog Cuddles." The Sultan listened to the story of how Cuddles had been the first to try to save his daughter, and how he had not been afraid of coming to the palace. "It is strange," said the Sultan, "but this very day the palace potter has left my employment, and I have need of another. I will send for your father." So Ahmed and Cuddles had tea with the Sultan and his daughter. Soon afterwards, Ahmed went to live in the house near the palace, where his father became the royal potter, and Cuddles became a royal dog, and then wore a collar with jewels in it.